Ukraine has completely thwarted the Russian offensive near Sumy. The armed forces of Ukraine have liberated the village of Filiya on the border of the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions. The Kremlin is preparing a new mobilization. Men are already not being allowed to leave the country. Ramzan Kadyrov is terminally ill. The Chechen dictator is losing power due to health problems. SBU drones struck Russian tankers and pumping stations in the port of Prymorsk. Operation Eastern Guard is a response to the recent Russian drone attack on Poland. The Kremlin is threatening the alliance by deploying an Iskander missile system near the Polish border, while Viktor Orbán claims that the Poles are up to their ears in the war. Hello, my name is Dnipropetrovskaya, and right now here are the main headlines. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel so we don't lose touch with you on YouTube. And now to the news from the front. I'll start with some good news. The armed forces of Ukraine have liberated the village of Filiya on the border of the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions. The successful offensive operation was carried out by the fighters of the Shkval battalion of the 425th Separate Assault Regiment Skala. And as they say, the occupiers tried to stage some kind of PR stunt and hung the Russian tricolor over the settlement. But the Ukrainian assault troops didn't let the Russians carry out their plan. And now, let's move further north. As of today, it can be stated that the Russian offensive operation in Sumy has been thwarted.
The Russian offensive operation in Sumy has been completely disrupted by our forces. Fighting continues in the border areas of the Sumy region. However, the Russian group in the Sumy direction has lost its offensive capabilities as a result of the losses it has suffered.
There is important news from the Kharkiv region. The Russians, overcoming obstacles, enter Kupiansk and once again use the pipe. And this is already the third time. The enemy uses pipes to move their groups forward. The first time was in Avdiivka, the second time was near Sudzha.
The Katsabs have built an entire logistical artery. The entrances to the pipe are located in the area of Lyman Pershayai. For moving inside the pipe, specially designed carts on wheels are used, as well as electric scooters where the height allows. The route from the outskirts to Kupiansk takes about 4 days, so special rest areas and food supplies have been set up along the way. In this way, organized enemy groups reach Radkivka without significant losses and then move south into the controlled forest. After that, they disperse in Kupiansk and reach the railway.
According to Deep State, the occupiers have already entered the residential districts of Kupiansk, while the head of the Kupiansk city military administration, Andriy Besedin, stated that there are no Russians in the city and that the fighting is taking place in the outskirts. Remember, just yesterday we told you about the drone attack on the Russian port in the Leningrad region.
Quiet. At least close it. What if it suddenly falls on Lukoil now? Yeah, right on Lukoil.
So Reuters, citing sources in the security service of Ukraine, reports that in the port of Prymorsk, SBU drones struck 2 Russian tankers and a pumping station. It is also known that during the SBU special operation, 2 vessels from Russia's Shadow Fleet were damaged.
The attack by Ukrainian drones on the northwestern Russian port of Prymorsk has, for the first time, led to a suspension of loading at the country's key western oil terminal. This was reported by 2 industry sources and the Ukrainian military.
In fact, after the strike, Russia's largest port for petroleum product exports on the Baltic Sea suspended its operations due to the sanctions of the good drones. In my opinion, for now, these are the most effective sanctions on the market, so to speak. I never cease to admire the courage and heroism of Ukrainian soldiers. They are holding the front and standing up to a huge horde that vastly outnumbers them. That's why I urge everyone to support the armed forces of Ukraine. And if you can't do that, at least write them a few kind words in the comments. They do watch us. Despite its statements about striving for peace, the Kremlin appears to be preparing for a new wave of mobilization, and at the very least, there are questions for men who are being summoned by the military enlistment office, and the country is not letting them leave. For the first time in Russia, a case has been recorded where a man was not allowed to leave the country because of an electronic draft notice. This has been reported by Russian media themselves.
A 28-year-old resident of Moscow was planning to fly to Turkey, but at Sheremetyevo airport during a document check, it turned out that he was banned from leaving the country by order of the military enlistment office. Officers on site explained that the restriction can only be lifted by appearing in person at the military enlistment office.
Well, I'm curious, when will they start mobilizing those Russians who support the special military operation only as long as they can sit on their couch and fight from there? Maybe then they'll start to realize that this isn't a special operation but a war in which Putin wants to occupy an independent country. Although, who am I kidding? What kind of thoughts would they have? Let's not forget who we're talking about here. We're talking about Russians. Due to health problems, Kadyrov has almost withdrawn from managing Chechnya. According to Novaya Gazeta Europe, citing a source in the FSB administration for the Chechen Republic, Kadyrov, who was diagnosed with pancreatic necrosis 6 years ago, cannot come to terms with his illness and the limitations it imposes. It is also known that in May 2025, Kadyrov asked the Russian dictator Putin to dismiss him from his position. In short, we will tell you more about everything in the following report.
Kadyrov is not the same anymore. The health of the head of Chechnya began to deteriorate rapidly, and this was immediately reflected in the appearance of Putin's loyal servant. From a sporty, muscular and self-confident man, Kadyrov is turning into a helpless, constantly tired and sick old man. For several years, the head of Chechnya has been seriously ill, as evidenced by his unhealthy appearance and regular disappearances from the public eye. He stopped exercising regularly, which had always played a big role in his image, and started wearing noticeably looser, baggier clothes.
In general,
Early August, Chechen television showed the head of the republic inspecting the construction of new neighborhoods, looking heavyset. In the footage, he was mostly standing, but when he did move, he did so slowly and stiffly. Moreover, the segment was dominated by shots of the construction itself, not of Kadyrov, which is very uncharacteristic for him. After all, Don always used to love being the center of attention.
Life is interesting sometimes.
Here's another example that things aren't going well for Kadyrov. On September 1st, he visited the Grozny Education Center. But he could barely move, as if he had turned to stone.
we see how he looks, we see how he walks, how he talks, we see how he has changed. It's obvious that he is really very seriously ill. In fact, the question arises, why is he stepping back from management but not resigning? I think the answer is very simple. He hasn't managed to push through the Kremlin the appointment of his successor, his son Adam, and accordingly, he simply cannot let go of the main levers of power from his already very much weakened and trembling hands.
The Chechen leader, who was diagnosed with pancreatic necrosis 6 years ago, cannot come to terms with his illness and the limitations it imposes. He has repeatedly ignored doctors' orders. Due to his poor health, Kadyrov nearly drowned at a resort in southwestern Turkey.
But as long as he is alive, the Kremlin does not dare to force him to resign because the Kremlin already has too many problems today. And getting involved in another significant problem in Chechnya is certainly not at all in President Putin's best interest right now. So as long as he is alive, he will continue to remain at the helm, at least formally. Whoa.
In August, Kadyrov held only one meeting and only one appointment in his office, but it's not just because of health problems. Don is simply no longer needed in Chechnya.
The goals and objectives of the Federal Center have been achieved. And the Federal Center no longer needs someone like Ramzan Kadyrov. And moreover, the Federal Center no longer needs a special status, neither for Ramzan Kadyrov, nor for the Kadyrovites, nor for Chechnya itself. And Ramzan Kadyrov no longer has a direct line to the Kremlin. Ramzan Kadyrov has a curator. Ramzan Kadyrov has a certain boundary that he cannot cross. And the Federal Center fulfills this role. The role of curator, owner, and the enforcer of the Kremlin's will in the territory of the Chechen Republic and throughout the entire North Caucasus.
Simply put, Kadyrov doesn't have much time left. It seems his rule is coming to an end.
We can even go beyond the borders of Chechnya, for example. Ramzan Kadyrov is a figure in many criminal cases. Ramzan Kadyrov is involved in many fraudulent organizations and schemes that have passed through Chechnya over the past 20 years. In fact, he's not even a necessary witness for the Kremlin anymore.
According to the Institute for the Study of War, the death of the Chechen dictator or his removal from office, if it happens during or immediately after the end of the war in Ukraine, could leave Putin's interests in the North Caucasus unprotected unless an appropriate successor is appointed.
Now, I'd like to talk about some very interesting, at least in my opinion, cause and effect relationships. So, first, there are explosions at Russian oil refineries because of visits from friendly drones. And then, after these explosions and visits, the Russian Ministry of Defense consistently reports that everything was shot down, but somehow there's no gasoline at gas stations in Russia. There's no gasoline, but as you say, you're holding on.
Gas station owners are reporting supply disruptions. Some refineries haven't shipped 92 or 95 octane gasoline for weeks. Some gas stations are closing or limiting fuel sales. Lines have already been reported in more than 20 regions, from the Far East and temporarily occupied Crimea to the Ryazan, Saratov and Rostov regions, as well as Kalmykia and Tatarstan.
Yes, a so-called fuel crisis is looming in Russia. Even the pro-government propaganda media have acknowledged the problem, although the official authorities explain it only as a seasonal increase in demand. Yes, as we can see, when it comes to communicating with the people, everything is as stable as ever in the Kremlin. Well, so to speak, the sanctions of the good drones are as real as the other sanctions. The European Union has extended individual sanctions against Russia for another 6 months. It is known that the EU Council has extended individual restrictive measures until March 15, 2026. They apply to more than 2,500 individuals and legal entities. These sanctions include asset freezes, bans on entry into the EU and transit, as well as a prohibition on providing financial and economic resources to those on the list, which, it must be admitted, is also quite pleasing. Because the good drones' sanctions mostly target the oil refining sector, while the EU's auto sanctions hit specific Russians and their businesses. Then continuing on this topic, the US will urge the G7 countries to create a mechanism for confiscating $300 billion of frozen Russian assets. Bloomberg reports that Washington is proposing not only to use the profits from these funds, but also to tap into the assets themselves to finance Ukraine's defense. The US will also increase pressure on India and China for financing Putin's war machine. This is being reported by the Western press. All the details are with our journalists.
The U.S. is urging the G7 countries to force India and China to impose higher tariffs on the purchase of Russian oil.
First of all, it's important to understand that when analyzing why the sanctions against Russia did not have the expected effect, there is an effect, but more was anticipated. It's because the sanctions were imposed by Western countries, while the countries of the Global South did not implement them, primarily India and China. And then they started thinking, how can we get India and China to join? Even if not de jure but de facto the sanctions against Russia. And they decided that this is an element of these so-called secondary sanctions or secondary tariffs, when tariffs are imposed against a country for buying Russian resources.
By raising the purchase price of oil, the U.S. wants to push Moscow to the negotiating table with Ukraine, reports the Financial Times.
It seems to me that this premise is far from realistic from the start. Well, of course, weakening Moscow is also to our advantage, but in this regard, there are quite a few problems, a great many, in fact.
Experts note that the U.S. is using Russia's war in Ukraine as a pretext to impose tariffs against India and China.
This is being done, let's say, from the US perspective, simply because they want to do it. From the EU's perspective, they need there to be at least some pressure on Russia. But this is a very important and significant point. Is Russia really the main reason? Or is it, let's say, that we actually want something else? And the real underlying reason is that the United States wants to impose these tariffs against both China and India. Because, to give some background, in April of this year, the US raised tariffs on products from many countries, but this caused certain problems within the United States itself. And many people said that you can't do this without a casus belli, that is, without a reason for imposing these tariffs, a pretext for conflict.
Journalists from the New York Times reminded that in August, the U.S. raised tariffs on imports from India to 50% because of India's purchases of Russian oil. In April, U.S. President Donald Trump sharply increased tariffs on imports from China, but in May, he lowered them after a strong negative reaction from the market.
Will Trump achieve anything before a possible meeting with Yazemkin, which could take place in Tarifskaya in South Korea, actually in Kyates, I believe, on October 30th, if I'm not mistaken. It might be later, but we know that with Donald Trump, these schedules can shift spontaneously, often changing without much advance notice or warning. This kind of unpredictability makes it very difficult to know exactly what will happen or when, so it is impossible to predict anything for sure.
Free trade is a fundamental principle of the European Union's activities. The very introduction of tariffs contradicts the statutory provisions of the EU, which support sanctions against the Kremlin.
There is agreement on the need to put pressure on Russia, but the approaches are fundamentally different. They are searching for this common ground. Let's hope it will be found. In any case, it is extremely important for us to weaken Russia economically, as this is considered a key step in limiting its influence and ability to act on the world stage. However, the methods by which the West can achieve this are currently quite contradictory, with different countries and policymakers often holding varying opinions about the most effective strategies to use.
Economic pressure on Russia is exactly what both the EU and Ukraine need, as it restrains the enemy while negotiations are ongoing.
The EU is only now beginning to understand that there is an existential threat coming from Russia, and the 23 drones that reached Poland are the materialization of this threat. Today it's 23 drones, but what will happen in 2 months is unclear. Therefore, naturally, Europe can be brought around to the idea of these secondary sanctions precisely through the argument of the Russian threat, which is what the US is doing now. If Europe is pressured enough, then China and India might start to wonder whether it's worth buying.
It's difficult to replace Russian goods on the market, but it's entirely possible. For this to happen, first and foremost, there needs to be political will and desire from Europe.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Meanwhile, internecine wars are raging within Putin's inner circle. In Russia, the Kadyrovites and the Orthodox oligarch Malofeev are unable to divide power and influence between themselves. What is at stake and where could this feud lead? More on this in the following report.
Ramzan Kadyrov's farewell court. The dying Dondon is preparing some real action for the Kremlin. A spy public, known for leaking information, reports, in Grozny, they are fed up with Moscow, ignoring their demands to curb the activities of the ultra-right, nationalist, xenophobic and anti-migrant organization, Russian Community.
The guys banded together to protect themselves and defend their homeland from the numerous enemies of the people.
The Russian Community emerged in Russia at the end of 2020. Its unofficial leader is believed to be the irreplaceable head of the investigative committee Bastrikin, and its curator is said to be the Orthodox millionaire Konstantin Malofeev. The Russian Community is known for its fight against migrant workers. It has a huge number of pages on social networks, including those on resources banned in Russia. On their channels, the ultranationalists promote their ideas and post videos of their confrontations with newcomers to the Russian Federation. In many regions of the country, such vigilante groups are active. Dressed in uniforms and balaclavas, these toughs go on raids with the police.
When will they finally introduce a visa regime and full control over all arrivals from Central Asia? How many more Russian children and women must be raped by migrants? How many men have been killed? We are in a real war here. I'm not talking about the special military operation right now. The war is right here in Russian cities. This fire has already come to our land. People, wake up, we are being maimed and killed by foreigners. The worst is yet to come, because there are about 600,000 migrant children in Russia who do not attend school. This is an uncontrolled environment where crime, Wahhabism, separatism and terrorism are being formed. Who will start cleaning out these Augean stables and when?
The peak of the Russian community's rise began after the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. At the moment, more than 150 regional and city branches of the organization have been announced, and its supporters are among the first to report people to the authorities. Besides targeting their own, Russians vent their anger on migrants, many of whom are Chechens. And this has already started to seriously annoy the Kadyrov clan. According to sources, in Grozny they have decided to launch a campaign of so-called reverse discrimination. As a counter to the Russian community, the fading Dondon has come up with his own project.
The first focal points will be precisely those cities where the Russian community is actively filming and spreading videos humiliating Chechens. Branches of the movement will start appearing in Moscow, St. Petersburg and Yekaterinburg, and later, according to Kadyrov's plan, across the entire country. At the same time, in Chechnya itself, there is already discussion about creating headquarters to coordinate outreach, including through social networks and religious centers.
Here is the presentation of Kadyrov's idea. On Alodinov's page, a repost appeared from the newly created group, Community of People's Friendship.
An important step toward uniting the true patriots of our country. I, Maxim Baranov, am the head of this project. The creation of such a space is solely my initiative. My respected elder brother, assistant to the head of the Chechen Republic, hero of Russia, and commander of the Akhmat Special Forces, Alodinov, is supporting me in this important undertaking. But it is important to understand that he is not the head of the community. I invite everyone who shares our values and is ready to contribute to the development of our motherland to join the ranks of true patriots.
And even though the head of the Community of People's Friendship tries to divert attention away from Alodinov, his influence is clearly visible in all the few posts in the group. Here, for example, is a pathetic attempt by Apti to show that all nationalities in Russia are united.
I am Chechen by nationality. My religion is Islam, which is the faith I follow. So, may I ask, who are you?
Mustafa.
Mustafa, what's your nationality? Russian. Russian. Russian Mustafa?
Yes.
I see. Where are you from?
From Ramenskoye in the Moscow region.
In the Moscow region. So here you go. This is our Russian Mustafa. Well,
I guess I have some Caucasian features. Maybe from my great-grandfathers, perhaps. Of course. I don't get offended about the Chechen part in Grozny.
And why would you be offended? It's fine.
One God. Well, that's the most important thing.
Right. See? Good job. So Mustafa is Russian by nationality from Ramenskoye. Okay. I want to show you this. So, teacher, Imam of the Special Forces, Akhmat. What is your nationality? Lezgin. Lezgin, please. So, what is your nationality? Russian. Russian. Where are you from?
Ulyanovsk region.
Ulyanovsk region. Please, just so, please.
Hamster. Cheetah Transbaikal territory.
Please. Well, of course, you don't look like a hamster. You're too big. So, in short, what's your nationality? Russian. Russian, please.
Dini, by nationality Russian from Rostov region. According to insiders, Grozny is launching a large-scale PR campaign involving activists who will start disrupting the actions of the Russian community and shaping a counter-narrative. Sources clarify that the structure will operate as a mobile network of headquarters. At the same time, the activists will demonstratively support other minorities as well for informational effect. The main goal of the organization is to create the impression among the audience that Kadyrov's project protects everyone, while the Russian community are neo-Nazis disguised as patriots.
The Kadyrovites will test the pilot of the Friendship of People's community in Moscow. Adam Delimkhanov will be responsible for the community's influence in the capital. After that, the network will spread to other regions of Russia. Of course, that's if they win the first battles with the Russian community. If they haven't yet been accepted into the latest fight, at the very least they've shown that their activities in Chechnya have been noticed. On their public page, they mocked the leader's clothing and refer to him only as Baran Maximov.
Reading the comments under previous episodes, I see that many of you are watching us from Kazakhstan, Moldova, Europe, and even the USA. We, Ukrainians, are very grateful to you for your support and proud that we have such reasonable viewers. Let us know in the comments under this episode as well which country you're watching us from and whether your country supports us in our fight, well, basically, against the evil empire. I always enjoy reading your comments. And for now, we continue because the most interesting part is still ahead. After the Russian drone attack in Poland, NATO is launching the Eastern Sentinel mission. The launch of the Eastern Sentinel mission was previously announced by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and the head of NATO forces in Europe, General Alexis Grinkevich. A key aspect of the mission is an entirely new defense structure. According to Rutte, Allied forces will be involved in this, including Denmark, France, Britain, Germany and other countries.
On Friday, NATO launched an operation called Eastern Sentinel to strengthen the defense of Europe's eastern flank in response to Russian drones entering Polish airspace earlier this week, said Secretary General Mark Rutte.
Speaking of Russian drone attacks on Poland, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stated that the latest Russian missiles can reach London or Madrid in a matter of minutes. And that is why it is a mistake to think that life in Western Europe is significantly safer than on its eastern flank.
The problem is that there is a direct threat to the eastern flank, for example, from drones or anything else that could endanger our allies. But I don't particularly like all this ongoing and persistent talk and discussion about the so-called Eastern Flank, because it tends to create, in the minds of many people, the impression or belief that if I happen to live in a city like Madrid or London, I am somehow much safer, more protected, or less at risk than if I live in Tallinn. That's not true at all, because these latest, most advanced Russian missiles, when they are launched, will fall and strike at speeds that are 5 times the speed of sound, which is incredibly fast. And in reality, they only need about 5 to 10 minutes more to reach cities like Madrid or London than they do to reach Tallinn or Vilnius. So in this sense, let's all agree and acknowledge that within this alliance, which is made up of 32 countries, we all live in a way on the eastern flank, sharing the same risks and responsibilities.
Meanwhile, Russia has demonstratively rolled out an Iskander missile system right onto the highway in the Kaliningrad region near the Polish border. What do you think that is? An attempt to intimidate? A signal to the West? Or is the Kremlin really ready to strike Poland? Write your thoughts in the comments. Meanwhile, in Poland itself, there's a line for military training, and Poles are preparing for the worst. In the border town of Braniewo, hundreds of people are digging trenches, learning to shoot, and practicing what to do in case of war. Poles are also traveling to Ukraine to learn from their experience in destroying Russian drones. The Bundestag has decided that NATO troops should shoot down Putin's drones while they're still over Ukrainian territory, so they don't reach them. The notorious Russian drones were headed toward the military hub in Rzeszów, and new evidence has emerged showing that the attack was clearly planned by the Russian army. The Russian drone attack on Poland is still causing a strong reaction around the world. We've gathered all the most important information, so let's watch the report next.
With the strike on Poland, the Kremlin has crossed a line. This is a decisive moment for Europe and the North Atlantic Alliance. If they show weakness, Putin will see it as an invitation for new attacks and provocations.
What is your reaction to the drone incursion into Poland? Could it have been a mistake? It could have been a mistake, perhaps an error in judgment or a misunderstanding, but regardless of the circumstances, I am not happy about anything at all related to this entire situation, but I sincerely hope that it will eventually come to an end. That night, when a total of 19 Russian drones flew over the territory of Poland, 400 drones plus an additional 40 missiles flew over the skies of Ukraine. It was not a mistake.
Russian Z-bloggers are already openly stating with details that the drones over Poland were not an accident.
First of all, the drones that entered Poland were not ordinary Gerans. As has already been noted, some Gerans were equipped with additional fuel tanks, something that has never been observed on any Ukrainian Geran. Secondly, although relatively simple, the drones were equipped with CRP antennas for protection against electronic warfare. In other words, drones specifically designed for the Republic of Poland entered its airspace with a very clear mission: to fly as far as possible over Poland.
Right now, for Europe and NATO, it is important that the response is not limited to just words. Essentially, the raid by Russian drones demonstrated the unpreparedness of European countries to repel massive aerial attacks and also cast doubt on the alliance's Article 5.
Poland's air defense systems, as well as those of its allies, were only able to successfully shoot down about 20% of the incoming aerodynamic weapons. This is an extremely negative result. Meanwhile, on the very same day, according to Western intelligence agencies, Ukraine's air defense systems shot down 90% of aerodynamic, aeroballistic weapons and cruise missiles.
All the formal prerequisites and necessary conditions for invoking Article 5 were present, because what occurred was a deliberate and intentional act of military aggression against a NATO country, and therefore against all of NATO collectively. In fact, NATO countries are, at this moment, not yet ready to officially acknowledge this.
While the US president is smoothing things over, European politicians, realizing that massive drone attacks could soon become a new reality, have become more active.
Following this incident, corresponding statements were made and, more importantly, practical steps were taken. France deployed 3 Rafale jets to Polish territory for joint airspace patrolling. In addition, Sweden provided additional air defense systems. Germany announced the strengthening of air defense systems on Polish territory. And accordingly, the Poles themselves have drawn their own conclusions.
The main conclusion is that the key to Europe's security is the Ukrainian army and its experience. For this reason, Poland is sending its military personnel to Ukraine to learn how to shoot down Russian drones.
If, for example, we even simulate Russia's latest anti-record, 800 drones plus missiles in a combined attack, say, in one night against Poland, well, I think it would simply be a nightmare for NATO countries. And at some point, their M16S, F-35S, and so on will simply run out of missiles, and that will basically be the end of their ability to respond. That's why, of course, they're not ready. And of course, only Ukraine can help both itself, NATO, the European Union, and in general, the collective West to stand up to the threats that the Russian Federation is currently demonstrating.
Apart from the effectiveness of air defense, NATO is also losing to Ukraine when it comes to the economy. While the West spends millions of dollars to shoot down cheap Russian drones, Kyiv is actively introducing cost-effective innovations into its air defense system, such as destroying Shaheds using FPV drones.
For example, a carrier drone that ascends to a certain altitude and patrols there, waiting for Shaheds to approach, and it climbs to the necessary height at just the right moment. The command post relays information to its crew, telling them that a Shahed is heading in their direction. These drones take off and patrol the area, waiting for the Shaheds to arrive. After that, anti-aircraft FPV drones are launched. These are the mother drones, so they launch them. And in order for the small drones not to waste energy in the air, they immediately dive from altitude onto the Shaheds.
In addition, European politicians are once again raising the issue of closing the skies over Ukraine, if not with their own armies and air forces, then at least by supplying air defense systems and long-range missiles, which would allow Ukraine to destroy both Russian production facilities and drone launch sites.
The most effective way to combat enemy drones during times of war is to completely eliminate their production facilities as well as their launchers, thereby significantly reducing their operational capabilities. It is important that NATO partners quickly equip Ukraine so that it can take measures against these targets on Russian soil.
Putin has deliberately crossed the line, and now he will either pay for it by prompting increased aid to Ukraine with a focus on supplying air defense systems and missiles, or the people of Europe, especially in the east, will have to get used to air raid sirens.
Russian drones entered Poland because the Poles are up to their ears in the war. In fact, this is how Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán responded to the Russian drone attack on Poland. Orbán called the situation itself unacceptable, but expected since the Poles are up to their ears in the war. However, at the same time, he stated that Hungary stands in solidarity with Poland.
The Hungarians are not involved in the war. They are keeping their distance. The Poles are up to their ears in it.
And against this backdrop, Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski stated that after the Russian drone attack on Poland, the country does not plan to break off diplomatic relations with Russia because it does not see any reason to do so. At the same time, Sikorski reminded that Poland has already restricted the activities of Russian diplomats in certain voivodeships and has called on its European partners to reduce their number in their own countries. It would seem, gentlemen, that we had already hit rock bottom, but then someone knocked from below from the Moscow circus.
Revving up like crazy, fucks, just climb in, hurry up and get in with me, we'll drive off into the distance like in a movie.
Why all this? No one at the circus could explain it. In short, as we can see, the Z madness has reached the circuses too. What can I say? Those who live in Russia don't laugh at the circus. What do you think of our news? Write to us about what we should change to become better, and we will definitely take it into account. In the meantime, please like this video to support what we do, and be sure to subscribe to our channel Ukraine Today so you don't miss our next episodes. See you soon!